What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another edition of Touchline Talk here on 110 Sports. I came into today, as after Tuesday's show, absolutely planning on starting and talking primarily about the fact that Lionel Messi has told Barcelona he wants out and he might be able to leave on a free transfer depending on how legal things play out. And I had an entire top 25 for European teams as we got this next season ready to go. And we're not doing that top 25 today. Yesterday's events were monumental. They absolutely deserve the primary conversation, the primary part of this show today. And we are gonna talk about Messi. We're gonna talk about some soccer things in the second half of the show because sports are still going on in Europe, even though they've pretty much shut down again in the US here and so many teams are on strike. But, this is only in 2020 can you have a situation in which the best soccer player in the world, maybe the greatest of all time, tells the only club he's ever known he wants to leave, opening up a world of possibilities. And that's not even the biggest news, the biggest talking point on a soccer show like this one. But that's where we are. That's what's happening in this world. That's what athletes are doing, and that's the impact that they're having right now. And I want to start by going all the way back to Colin Kaepernick, and we'll connect this to what's happening right now and what happened yesterday. But when he started kneeling, and after I did some thinking and listening after the first couple weeks, I came to a question that has formed the main part of how I've been approaching and thinking about all of the stuff that's been happening with racial injustice and more broadly just athlete activism these past 3-4 years. And that question is, why do my thoughts on what athletes are doing and what people are doing in this space matter? That's not to say that my thoughts aren't valid or that I don't have a right to speak out, or that your thoughts aren't valid and you don't have a right to speak out. But so much of this conversation, I feel like, particularly earlier, was about was Kaepernick right or wrong? Are these athletes right or wrong for doing X, Y, or Z? And I just kept wondering, why does it matter whether you or I think they're right or wrong? That's not what this is about. I'm not here to tell people what to do or how to live their lives. Just like LeBron James, for example, isn't going to come in here and tell me how to run this show today or tell you how to do your job. Again, it doesn't mean that our voice isn't important and that we don't have a right to express our thoughts. But in the broader scheme of things, I've tried to stay away from that part of the conversation and focus on two other things that I think are just way more important. And those two things are, number one, the fact that whether I agree or whether you agree or anybody agrees, with what's happening, independent of your individual opinion, I am always going to go to bat for and support athletes and people who use their platform to try and make a positive change and do what they think is right and look outside of just being an athlete and figure out how they can make a broader impact on the world. I might, and that's not to say that I disagree with the strike. That's not specific to this at all. And most of the stuff that's gone on, I've definitely agreed with and wholeheartedly support. But even in a situation where I'm not so sure I would have done things the exact same way, again, I just don't think my opinion in that particular scenario is all that important. What's important is acknowledging that these players and these athletes are trying to do good and trying to make a difference and trying to use the platforms that they've been given to really enact change and do things that, your average person may not be able to, because this is LeBron James we're talking about, or this is, the best soccer players in this country, or whatever it might be. And the second part, specifically going back to Kaepernick, and then from the kneeling that has taken place since, not only should we be applauding athletes for trying to do what they think is right and having the courage to go outside of sports, but we also need to make sure that we're supporting people's right to protest and their freedom of speech and all these things protected by the Constitution, protected by the U.S. legal system. And that's where I think we had a lot of problems with Kaepernick. And, we all missed the boat on that one. We as a society missed the boat on not just looking at it as, hey, this is a peaceful expression that is constitutionally protected. And going back to point one, all he's trying to do is bring awareness to an issue and do something to make the world a better place. That's the goal here. And we got it twisted, and we really messed that one up. And I saw Nicole Auerbach of The Athletic make this point, and I wholeheartedly agree. Let's make sure that we don't do that again this time. But that's really what I've come to on these conversations generally, is that it's not about me and it's not about my opinion. It's about making sure that we support and respect these choices that athletes are making, because they have every right to do and say as they please and act how they want to as people, as individuals. It gets so tricky and sort of messy, I feel like, because nobody's looking at somebody like me or your general person on the street and saying, I feel like you owe me something. But because these athletes provide us entertainment and we feel like we're a part of them because there's this connection between sports teams and their fans, all of a sudden what LeBron James or insert any athlete here is doing, we have this tendency to then make it about us too, and this is impacting us. When all of these people, these guys and women and these athletes are, and you saw this coming from Ariel Atkins of the Washington Mystics yesterday. These are just people. They're individuals with thoughts and opinions outside of sports. They have every right to express those just like you and I do. It just happens that they're doing it in a space where it's amplified because it's on ESPN and all of those things, because they're high-profile individuals. But they're people at the end of the day. And we very easily sometimes forget that, I think. So to me, that's what these and since I've sort of came to that conclusion back in 2016, that's where I've been coming from, and I was reminded that again yesterday. I'm not going to sit here and talk about whether I think it's right or wrong. I'm wholeheartedly in support of it, but that's not the important thing to me. The important thing is that we applaud all of these players, NBA, WNBA, MLB, MLS, for saying there are things outside of sports that are more important, that we are going to try and use our platform to fix systemic problems in this country, and that they're using a right to express their thoughts and their opinions, and we've got to make sure that we defend that and don't get into a situation where we're blackballing people again. And I don't think that's going to happen, because the world's a very different place now in 2020. But that's where the conversation starts for me, and that's where I'm coming from on this. Is it's not, from my perspective, it's not about me. Additionally, let's make sure we don't fall into the trap of pushing another agenda onto this, or changing the narrative and making this something it's not. These players want to play. And you're now seeing that there's a lot of momentum apparently in the NBA to finish the season. After more conversations last night, and they're still talking, but it's just another piece of evidence to that fact. These players want to play. They just feel like they're in a position where the support and the assistance and leadership that they want to see from politicians, from the government, from local officials, from the police, you name it, is just not there. They don't feel like these things that are more important to them than sports, and for good reason, are being taken care of. And so they said, we're going to do it ourselves to the extent that they can, or we're going to at least get involved. And we're going to make it very clear that this is more important to us. You know, nobody was going out there thinking, well, how can we go on strike and just walk out and stop playing in the middle of a pandemic when everybody's already hurting financially? That's not where this came from. If collectively we as a society and leadership had done a better job and, you know, not systemically oppressed people for hundreds of years, then we wouldn't be talking about this. If we would have done a better job listening to people, and specifically people of color, who have been experiencing this for centuries, we wouldn't be in this position, and we wouldn't be having practically a nationwide strike right now. And Sasha Question of the LA Galaxy made this point yesterday. Once they decided not to play, you know, he did a little press conference, and he said, people telling me to stick to sports, I'm kind of trying to. You know, this is not what I want. But it's just to a point where those players feel like, if not us, who, if not now, when? And so I thought that was very poignant from Question. That was his rebuttal to people telling him to stick to sports. They don't want to have to, I think generally speaking, they don't want to have to be at the center of this national, social, you know, monumental change. Sure, they want to be involved and use their platform, but I don't think anybody wanted this to come to a work stoppage. But at the end of the day, they felt like they had no choice. So it's on all of us now to listen and to make sure that we don't twist this narrative. This is about racial injustice. This is about police brutality. This is about trying to create a country where everybody is actually treated fairly and treated like they matter and that their lives are important. That's what this is. That's what Kaepernick was too, and we really messed that up, as I said before. More specifically on the MLS side of this, it was sort of an awkward situation because every game got canceled except for the first one, which was Nashville-Orlando. They went through and played. And so your immediate reaction, at least mine was, and Mark Anthony K of LAFC was not happy about this. You know, how do you sort of let that happen? How do you get one game when at this point the NBA had shut down? It was a matter of time before this was coming. I was sort of surprised that they let that game go through. But the similarity I'm going to draw here is what happened to the Big East tournament during when coronavirus went crazy in March. All the other conferences had decided they weren't going to play, but the Big East was still out there playing their game that day, and there was some point where they were the only ones still playing, and everybody's going, what in the world are you doing? Why is this one conference out here when everybody else is shut down? And they eventually called the game at halftime and then shut their tournament down too. But what Commissioner Val Ackerman said afterward has really resonated with me. And immediately that's where my mind went to when I heard what was coming out of Nashville and what some of the players and their manager were saying. Ackerman said, look, none of the other conferences told us. We were not informed by the city of New York where that tournament was taking place, that there was any change in policy and that there was going to be a big announcement. That we didn't know the situation had changed. We didn't know anybody else had changed their mind and decided not to play. By the time we found that stuff out, we had already tipped off. And so we just felt like there was no need to pull players off the field, off the court in the middle of a game. We'll get to halftime and then we'll say it's done. And all of a sudden, when you hear it from that perspective, it just sounds much more rational and makes sense. And that's exactly what you heard from Nashville, from their manager Gary Smith, from some of their players, was basically, you know, you're required to turn your phones off before the game. So by the time MLS is actually, and more specifically MLS's players, had decided they weren't going to play, you know, Nashville and Orlando were already on the field. They didn't know that this was coming. There was conversation, but it wasn't sort of a unified decision that had already been made. And, you know, there were other teams that were warming up. Inter Miami and Atlanta had a conversation on the field and said, we're not going to play. And so the explanation basically was, we didn't have our phones. We didn't know that anybody else had decided. At that point, I don't think anybody else had decided they weren't going to play. And so you find that out at halftime, and you're already halfway through the game. At that point, you just kind of finish it. So, in a vacuum, it looks like there was some disorganization and miscommunication and all those things, and I just don't think that's the case. I think everybody was on the same page about how they wanted to approach things. It's just they ran out of time, and that was sort of what you heard, is it just kicked off too early. So that part of this is important too, is making sure that we listen and wait for the explanation. And so that was, I really tried hard to wait and see what was going down there and what was going to be said from the players and the coaches who had gone through it in terms of why that game was played. Because there's part of this that, look, I think we also need to be careful to make sure that we're not going too far the other direction and saying that if a team had decided to play yesterday, that means they're racist or not in support of Black Lives Matter or something like that. But I feel like if you're going to do that, you have to have a good reason. Your natural inclination needs to be to just fall in line with everybody else on this monumental occasion, which the league did I would argue, consistently from top to bottom. I don't think Nashville and Orlando did anything differently than anybody else. They just kicked off before these decisions had been made. And so much of this and so much of life to me is about the why and being intentional about the decisions you make. And so I thought MLS, it would have been nice to see that decision made earlier, because it felt like the minute the NBA shut down, very, very similar to the coronavirus, that was it. Nobody else was going to keep playing, except for the NHL decided they were going to play their games last night. But you could see the domino effects falling. It just took a little bit longer, so you had one game played yesterday. But to me, that does not mean in any way, shape, or form that this league wasn't unified in their thoughts, that these players were not in agreement that these games should not be played. And that's the other part of this too. Again, Mark Anthony Kaye made this point. This was a decision by the players. The league just sort of had to fall in line, because you can't play if your players are on strike, you know. And so let's not forget that part of this as well, that these were conversations between players. Players saw what happened in the NBA and the WNBA and said, we're not going to play. And then MLS came out in full support, as did the teams. But it's not the other way around, where Major League Soccer and Don Garber made this call. This was very much from the players, and I think that's important to the players for people to keep in mind, that we made this call. We felt like this was important. We didn't feel comfortable playing. We didn't feel like we were in the right mental space to play. It wouldn't have been fair to fans, to ourselves, to anybody for us to play when something else that's much more important is on our mind. And finally, specifically to MLS and also the WNBA, the idea of LeBron missing out on however much money you would lose by not finishing the playoffs, and the money that then goes back to the TV broadcasters who don't get to broadcast those games, so they don't get the ad revenue and all of that, that's not something LeBron has to worry about. There are certainly NBA players who it's a much different situation for than LeBron, and I just keep using LeBron as an example here today. But in the NBA, it's just a very different cost-benefit analysis when it comes to deciding to go on strike like this. For Major League Soccer players, Carlos Vela will be fine, and Michael Bradley and Josie Altidore in Toronto will be fine. But your 17th guy on these rosters, your backup third-string goalkeeper, your guy on his rookie contract that you drafted in the MLS Super Draft out of college, this has real financial consequences for them. And the same thing goes with the WNBA, where those players, well, they just got a new collective bargaining agreement, are not making anywhere near the same money as your NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL players. There's a whole nother level of risk for these leagues where salaries are much lower and it's just sort of a job as opposed to being a millionaire. You know, there's a very clear distinction between your star players in any league, your star players and everybody else. But it's not like these MLS players and these WNBA players are living this incredibly luxurious lifestyle kind of thing. Yeah, they make good money, generally speaking. But there's a whole nother element to this that I also wanted to acknowledge from that perspective. That it's one thing for your Giannis Antetokounmpo and your LeBron and all these guys on max contracts to decide we don't need to go through with the NBA playoffs and not really worry about the money part of it. It's not about the money, of course, but that's something you have to consider, and that's something the NBA is still talking about from what's been reported, is that you got to make sure you're okay with giving up that money. You could have some real side effects here for Major League Soccer if this thing continues for an extended period of time. If it's a short-term thing where you reschedule some games, you know, there were no games scheduled for today, I believe, so you've just got yesterday's games to make up at some point. Toronto and Montreal play tomorrow on Friday night. It's not a big deal that maybe you're not playing this weekend and you find a way to reschedule those games. But at this point, it's just hard to know what happens next, which I think is a really interesting part of this that I don't even really want to speculate on because I don't know. And a lot of that, I think, comes back to the NBA. If the NBA says, and it sounds like we're going to find out really soon here, if the NBA says we're going to finish, whether there's some sort of demand or request that they put out and say, can we do these things first, or whatever it might be. If the NBA comes back and its players say, we want to finish, then I feel like that's pretty much the end of this. Like I said, maybe it goes on for a couple more days. Maybe you got to reschedule this weekend's games. But at the end of the day, you survive and it's fine. But if you get to a point where the NBA players leave that bubble in Orlando, there could be some massive consequences. And that's not to say it's the wrong thing. Again, I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. I completely understand why players would want to do that. But there is the money side to think of, and specifically for these, I don't want to say lesser leagues, because I don't like that as a fan of both Major League Soccer and the WNBA, but these leagues where there's just not as much money floating around, to be some of the first to jump in, and the only two to jump in pretty much wholeheartedly. You know, you had some MLB games were already sort of in the process of getting started when this thing happened. Some teams decided to play, some players decided not to play, but their teams played. The WNBA jumped on that real quick and said, yeah, we're not playing. Which, if you know anything about that league, should not surprise you in the slightest. And Major League Soccer pretty much did the same thing. It took them a little longer to get there. And they did have one game play, but that was just more timing. I think if it's an 8 o'clock kickoff instead of 7:30 or whatever it was. If it kicked off with the rest of the games, that it's not played either. So those were the 2 leagues. Baseball jumped into a certain extent. The NHL played their games last night. It was the leagues with more to lose from an individual financial perspective for these players that came out in the strongest support of the NBA in terms of joining in on this strike. And I think that's definitely worth acknowledging and pretty profound. And that I talked about at the beginning of the MLS's back tournament, where does Black Players for Change, that organization, go from here? They put together that very powerful demonstration before the kickoff of the first game. They've been active in talking about things. And will they have the support of the league to continue this movement and to do what they want and try and enact the change that they want to see? This is where having that communication open, having an organization like that, players who are unified in their thinking, it makes this a much easier pathway. And, you don't really see something like that in another league. And specifically another league where it's not a overwhelming majority of Black players. It's a different world in the NBA and the WNBA because you look up and down those rosters and, of course, there are players of all kinds of different ethnicities and racial backgrounds and stuff, but I think we also need to acknowledge that part of it too, that MLS, it was the Black players in the league, not the league as a whole, sort of, that are pushing this narrative. And of course, everybody got behind the Black Players for Change movement. I'm not trying to say that only Black players are fighting for social justice and racial equality right now in any way, shape, or form. But it is sort of unique that in a league where Black players are not the overwhelming majority, you have such a strong coalition making so much of an impact and being so active and working with the league and with the rest of the players and coming to a pretty unified stance on some things. It's much more difficult, and it's just a unique situation. I also wanted to mention that part of it. They're doing some really good work. Kudos to your Warren Cravals, Ray Gaddis's, Mark Anthony Kays, Justin Morrow's, all of these guys who have really put time and effort into this. It's quite profound to see. And you got another consequence of it last night, that as soon as this thing started happening, there was very little doubt in my mind that we were going to get cancellations in Major League Soccer. Some other leagues you weren't so sure, and the NHL went through with it. But because of the way that this league is working with these players, is listening, is allowing them to express themselves, I felt pretty confident this was what was going to happen. And so here we are. Just when you think we can't get to a more profound, stranger world, when you just when you think another incredibly monumental moment can't happen in 2020, we've now had sports shut down twice in the span of months, generally speaking. Of course, not all sports have shut down this time. But, you go from coronavirus to a nationwide strike, essentially. And, again, I don't know where we go from here. I had a what's next planned, and we're going to talk about the top 25 teams in European soccer entering this new season that's now underway with Ligue 1. And, you've got a Community Shield coming up this weekend as we get ready for the return of the Premier League. But I don't know what's next. So we're not going to be talking about what's next. You also have a Women's Champions League final this weekend. But I don't know where we go from here. I think we just got to stay focused on what's happening with the NBA, because that's going to dictate what the next steps are. And the final thing I'll say on this is, when we talk about, tangible change and we want to see more action. We being, I guess, specifically the players, because you're hearing that from the NBA some is, we want to see more. Part of that comes back to owners and the fact that, and I saw somebody make this point on Twitter, right, that the owners have the ear of the people who are making these policy decisions, who are in these leadership positions in politics, in a way that most people just don't. And when you go on strike, it's for a specific reason and specific request or demand, or whatever word you want to use. That's the difference between a strike and a boycott for me, right? A boycott is an economic target. Strike is there are conditions that are not being met that you feel like need to be met in your workplace. So one of the things that I'm very curious about that I'm waiting for is, what are those specific demands? Are there tangible things that, whether it's Major League Soccer or the NBA or whoever, these players can put together and say, we want to see these things? Because, of course, we can't fix all of the issues and make this a completely racially just, equal society for everybody overnight. The systemic problems are too deeply ingrained. They've been going on for too long. And, of course, I think everybody knows that who's on strike right now. That's not new information for anybody, obviously. So that's, to me, part of this next step is, was this more of a flash in the pan walkout kind of thing, where it was just, we want to make a statement and we're not focused on sports right now? Or is this more of an actual true strike where there are going to be conditions in order for employees to return to work and for sports to return? So that's kind of what to look for next, I feel like. Other than that, I don't know. This is just incredible stuff. But again, let's applaud these players for being this courageous, this brave, for caring about more than money, for caring about more than themselves, for trying to make change that needs to happen when it just feels like it's not coming. And for saying, enough is enough, and if nobody else is going to do this, then we're going to take it on ourselves and try and get this ball rolling to real, permanent, lasting change from a societal, national standpoint. Good for them. It's incredible. Sorry. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk soccer things. Messi, we got some moves that have had some transfer deals that have happened in the Premier League. Another update on the Harry Maguire case. Real soccer content, because like I said, with everything happening in the U.S., there are still things happening in Europe too. I don't want to ignore that. So, we're talking Messi. When we come back, you're watching Touchline Talk on 110 Sports. And welcome back to Touchline Talk. Apologize for that little coughing fit there. Just ran out of air, I guess, and it takes a lot out of you talking for that long without a break. So, apologize. We should be better now. Got a drink of water. We're good to go. So, in a normal world, or any other time except for 2020, the fact that Lionel Messi told Barcelona he wants to leave is absolutely the top of this show and the most talked about thing in the soccer world. And I didn't want to just ignore it. I want to talk about it. There are still things happening in the sports world outside of the strike right now. And I just don't think anybody can blame him for leaving. I mean, this is a guy who has served this club so well, has patched up so many holes, and has been failed by the board. And you heard Lawrence talk about this during our supporters corner, which is part of why I wanted to have him on. He's been fairly vocal about this. That, imagine what this team would have looked like a year or two ago without Messi. If you think the 8-2 against Bayern was bad with Messi, imagine what it would have been without him. And I think he just got to a point where he looked at it and said, I can't save this. This is beyond me. Which is a stinging indictment of where Barcelona is as a club right now. But is he wrong? Can you blame him? And I think that's basically sort of where Barcelona fans are at too. And what Lawrence said, No, of course you want him to stay, but I kind of understand why he wants out, even from a Barcelona perspective, as somebody who is a supporter of that club. I would get it. And I also think this could be a blessing in disguise for Barcelona. On the surface, of course, you don't want to lose Messi. But with the financial problems they have, getting that salary off your payroll is huge. And having, theoretically, some money to work with, because, and I talked about this very briefly at the top of the show, he has a clause in his contract that allows him to leave for nothing in May. The idea being, he can basically say, I'm out after every season. Immediately after, but he can make that decision. Of course, it's not May. And you've seen these contract things be taken very literally, with guys having to sign, 1-month extensions to stay with their clubs through the end of the season because their contract ran out on June 1st or whatever, because that's when seasons typically end. Which leads me to think that Messi is not going to get to leave for free. Which is also why I'm still not, and I'll talk about some potential destinations here, but I am not entirely convinced he's actually gone. I think this could be worked out because he loves this club so much, and because I don't think you're getting him for free. What seems like the most likely scenario, what I would guess, is that Barcelona says, okay, you can go. We could use the money. We could use a full rebuild under Ronald Koeman. This helps Antoine Griezmann, who basically takes up the same space on the field Messi does. We can just transition into the next era. But we're not letting you walk for free. But we're also not, I can't imagine somebody's going to pay a $700 million release clause. There's just no way. There's no way. So can you get into the Ronaldo, 100 million to Neymar's 200, I think it's 222 euros release clause that PSG paid for him, somewhere in that range. Now that's something that your bigger clubs could pay. So I think that's what's going to end up happening here, is that he's going to go for a transfer fee. It's not going to be a release clause. He's not going to get to go for free. There's just going to be sort of a compromise, figuring this thing out in the middle, because there are benefits to this from Barcelona's perspective, long term. Of course, short term, you're in real trouble next season without Messi on your team. But for a team in such a bad situation, financially, on the field, one guy can't fix that, and that's sort of what Messi, the conclusion he came to. And they're not winning the Champions League anytime soon, which is what he's wanting at this point in his career. So it was not the best ending in the world, and the idea of Messi's last game in a Barcelona jersey being an 8-2 thrashing is just kind of stunning and hard to process. But I think it's just time for both sides to end this. Shout out to Major League Soccer, by the way. The Vancouver Whitecaps sent out a tweet with it was a screenshot of a DM that they were going to send to Messi that said, "Hear me out," or something to that effect. And then the league on its website wrote a story about how Messi's decided to leave Barcelona. MLS is a possible destination. Apparently MLS is the only one that thinks that MLS is a possible destination at this moment for still the best player in the world. But shout out to Major League Soccer for being so ambitious and having the audacity to actually write that in a story. Love it. And yes, Inter Miami has talked to him. They've talked to Luis Suarez. But what I think is going to happen is that interest in coming to Major League Soccer is legit. But not right now. 3-4 years down the road. It's one of those things where, is there a reason to suggest that Messi couldn't be as good as Zlatan in his late 30s? You know, his game is not built on anything physical. It's all technical ability. And just the fact that he's just incredibly gifted. Right? It's not strength, it's not pace, it's just he's better than you at soccer. So there's every reason to think he could still be a really good player at 37, 38. I don't know how long he wants to play. But you saw what he's doing in his early to mid-30s here. You know, he's out of his prime. Still the best player in the world. Still carrying a team on his back in the Champions League. So, I think MLS is a real thing, but not right now. I mean, no. This dude has more Champions Leagues to win. So, to that end, I think there are really only 3 teams I could even see this happening. PSG, just because they have the money. He would get reunited with Neymar. They came so close that getting Messi, you could argue, puts him over the edge, makes him the best team in Europe. And I mean, it's PSG, so they got Neymar. They can go buy any, you can't rule him out of buying anybody. When all of a sudden the world opens up to Messi, teams that can afford him, PSG is always going to be near the top of that list. But I still feel like the second most likely destination is actually Inter Milan. Just because I don't feel like PSG really need to spend the money or have all that much interest in splashing that cash again. Whereas Inter Milan is really hurting for trophies recently. Has an opportunity to not only build off of, getting to a Europa League final this year and putting together a good season, but all of a sudden, if you add Messi to that team, not only are they the best team in Italy, they're right there competing for a Champions League too. So that part of it, and they've shown they will spend money. That's not a secret. So that I could see. I feel like that's the second most likely destination if he does leave. I could see an argument for PSG being 2 and Inter 3, but I think there are 3 teams. And of course, number 1 is Manchester City. I 100% buy that it's where Messi wants to go. I 100% buy that Pep wants him. And that they want to reunite with each other. The idea of a Messi, De Bruyne midfield, my goodness. Oh, can't even imagine what that would look like. I just smile thinking about it. Oh. But my question, and this is again why I'm still not convinced Messi's actually going to leave. Does Manchester City have the money to do this? Especially if they got to go shell out 100+ million, whatever currency value you want to use, euros, dollars. If it's up in the Neymar range, do they have the money? Yeah, they just sold Leroy Sané, but they just bought Nathan Ake. They bought Rodri, last summer. They're still spending money. They're not spending as much money. From a wage perspective, they can afford it. But can you balance this thing from a financial fair play perspective? Now, maybe FFP is just dead after Manchester City won that appeal. But do you want to put yourself under the microscope again after being confrontational with UEFA and just go say, hey, we didn't do anything wrong. We're going to go buy Messi. Maybe they're willing to go on a selling spree to make this work. But there's enough skepticism there for me that I'm not sold that any of these destinations actually are a no-brainer and it happens just like that. So I think there's a chance he still stays at Barcelona. I'm not ruling that out. But of course, we're going to follow this. Apparently, he's going to give his reasons for leaving at some point soon, according to some report. It's just strange stuff. And it's a big deal because he can absolutely tip the Champions League next year. If he goes to Manchester City, they are easily the best team in the world. And if they don't win the Champions League with that, you gotta really think about getting rid of Pep Guardiola. But I don't want to go down that road until it actually happens. We'll see. The City thing makes too much sense to me, and then he can go to NYCFC, which is sort of the ESPN report. What their plan would be is that he spends some time at Manchester City, and then he goes to NYCFC to round out his career. That's absolutely something I could see happening. If I had to guess, that's what it's going to be. But like I said, there are too many questions I still have to think that this is a done and dusted deal that A, he leaves, and B, if he leaves, it's going to be Manchester City. The other Manchester team had a tough go of it here. They got Pogba now tested positive. Wan-Bissaka's in quarantine. And Harry Maguire was found guilty of these charges in Greece, given a suspended prison sentence. I talked about on Tuesday how Gareth Southgate kind of went to bat for him and kept him in the England squad for these Nation League games, and then promptly dropped him after the guilty verdict came in. Maguire plans to appeal, and the reason his legal team wanted an extension on a delay of the trial was they had a matter of hours to put this thing together. The more I read about this, the more I think that Maguire has a real argument here. I am fascinated by this. And it's just such a strange sequence of events, and there are so many things being said that just simultaneously can't be true, coming from both sides here. And Manchester United is keeping him as their captain, and I refuse to just dismiss his side of the story. Once you get additional evidence and time to prepare, I think he could make the Greek police look really silly. So I don't want to say one way or another here and just come down on him, because he's saying he thought he was going to get kidnapped by plainclothes police officers. This is just crazy. And for the England part of this, I think it's just sort of in everybody's best interest. Gareth Southgate doesn't have to answer more questions about this. They don't need him. It's just not the end of the world. And it helps Maguire too, because... Sorry, I had to take a sip of water there. It helps Maguire because now it's just not another thing he needs to think about. He can stay focused on getting this appeal organized, getting ready for next season. I never got the impression from Southgate that this is going to hurt him long term with his status as an England national. And when you start talking about next year's Euros and things like that. So it was just the safest way to do this all around, is just drop him from the team, let him take care of his business and try and get whatever the truth is out there, tell his side of the story. England will go on without him. It's not a distraction and something you have to worry about addressing with the team and while you're on national duty from a media perspective. I am really, 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 I guess the word is intrigued. The more I read about this, the more I'm captivated and really am starting to wonder if Maguire was mistreated horribly. There are some real questions here that we may never know the answer to. And again, part of the problem, like I talked about on Tuesday, is there was no body cam. So it was this court case was a their word versus our word kind of thing. One side said this, one side said this. They decided to rule in favor of the prosecution. I mean, I think Maguire feels like he didn't get a fair trial. That's what the appeal is going to be. We'll see what happens. I'm definitely going to keep my eye on this, and it just is very, very sketchy and feels fishy to me. Maguire's former teammate, Ben Chilwell, and national team teammate, is now at Chelsea. There have been, some other things that have happened. Weston McKennie appears to be on his way to Juventus, but I want to wait until some of these deals are official. This one is official. Yesterday, Chelsea made the announcement. Leicester confirmed it. This is exactly what Chelsea needed. Frank Lampard knew it all along, and they wanted Chilwell all along. They got their guy. And if it wasn't Chilwell, it was going to be another left back. And I've been harping on this all year, pretty much, and since this show started. If you're going to play four at the back, you cannot play Marcos Alonso as your left back. He's not a left back. He is a left wing back. There is a difference. And it really hurt Chelsea on multiple occasions defensively. And specifically in that West Ham game. And I think it was Yarmolenko's goal. I think it was the winner. I texted a friend of mine. I said, and that's why Marcos Alonso cannot play left back. Because he got caught up the field. It's just a different mindset. And I love Alonso as a player. But he can't play in a back four. That's not what he does. And so, Chelsea's team, I still feel like, is built from when Antonio Conte was there, where you were playing three at the back and Alonso was phenomenal. From a roster construction standpoint. And so Lampard's coming in wanting to play this 4-3-3. And if you're going to insist on it and just try and fit these pieces into your system, there's a price to pay for that, as I've talked about before. But now, if you're going to sell your Emersons and your Marcos Alonsos to finance Werner, Ziyech, Chilwell, potentially Kai Havertz, potentially Thiago Silva, all of these guys, and so you're starting, and you got that. To me, I almost feel like Chilwell is the most important one of that group. Whoever Chelsea brings in, that he's more important than Timo Werner for what he does from a tactical, systematic standpoint for them. He is a modern, traditional fullback who does his job defensively, is good going forward. I still have some questions about his crossing ability. It's not that it's bad, it's just inconsistent. But he's so, and I think one of the most underrated skills that Chilwell has is he's just so good at joining the attack and combining and just holding on to the ball and helping your team get into good positions, that it's not, he's not Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson delivering pinpoint crosses. But he's just another attack-minded player that can beat guys off the dribble, that can pass into tight areas and just make life difficult for teams that you're playing against. He fits exactly what Chelsea's trying to do, so they solve one of the biggest holes. The only one remaining is center back. We've talked about this before too. There are all kinds of names being floated out there. It sounds like Thiago Silva's coming, which is going to help immensely. But that's what's missing from this Chelsea team. Your attackers are good enough. You've got enough depth there. The midfield was pretty good last year. You get a healthy N'Golo Kante, and now we're really talking. with your Kovacic's and all of that. You probably, I would assume they're trying to get rid of Jorginho. Maybe you got to drop Mason Mount into a little bit deeper position to fit these pieces. I don't know what they're going to do from that perspective. They don't have too many players now, especially if Havertz comes. But to me, this was the one you had to have. That I will not be sold on this team until they fix some of these defensive issues. Doesn't matter how many attacking pieces they buy. Same thing with Arsenal. That Arsenal can trick you into thinking they're going to be real, and I've definitely fallen for this. You go by Nicola Pepe, you got Lacazette, Aubameyang. You go, oh, that's a really good front three, and it is. But they're still leaking goals at the back. And so I think that not only does Chilwell just upgrade from your overall defensive talent, but he just fits so much better. He makes your life easier. He's an addition just simply from a positional standpoint that he's going to not get caught in as many bad spots and not be quite as aggressive as Alonso. And it's huge for a team that's trying to play a specific system. Lampard knew what he needed, and he went and got it. And from Leicester's perspective, if all they lose from this thing is Chilwell, Maddison just signed a new contract. Vardy was never going anywhere, but he signed a new contract too. If they can hold on to everybody else, specifically Ricardo Pereira and Maddison, they're going to be fine. Now, fine being relative, you missed your chance to get in the Champions League last year. We talked about that at length. Because now United's theoretically going to reinforce. You get a full year of Bruno Fernandes. They're going to be really good next year. Chelsea's going to be much better. Who knows what Mourinho can do with Spurs. You still got your top two. That window and that wall to break into the top four is very, very thick right now. You're going to have a real tough time getting past any of Chelsea, United, Liverpool, and City. But if you keep that team, aside from Chilwell, you find a replacement, that's absolutely a team that can win the Europa League and finish fifth again. Not saying that that's actually what's going to happen, but there was real doubt in my mind as to whether they could hold this thing together without the allure of Champions League football. And it sounds like they've been able to. Being in the Europa League helps. So, this was always, it sounds like it was sort of always impending. You had heard these rumors for months. It's official now. Really like it for Chelsea. Not the end of the world for Leicester. Dean Henderson also signed a new contract in Manchester United. Not surprising. It just, again, reinforces. You got two goalies now. He's going to be there. United's invested in him. I've given my thoughts on this before. I think it's what they had to do. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer apparently agrees with me. Hopefully, by Tuesday, we've got some more deals finalized. I just don't like talking, transfer speculation. I like to save it until these deals are done. So, we'll get to the Weston McKennies and all of that once they've got official announcements and they're holding up jerseys for their new teams. That's all we have for today. As always, Chris Brown coming up in an hour. Josh Molnick's tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. Check out all of our content at 110sportsmedia.com. Sign up for our newsletter. We're going to have 2 podcasts coming out in the next couple days talking about this strike and everything going on right now. Josh and I are recording one this afternoon. We'll record the bonfire on Friday probably. It's a crazy time. This is monumental stuff that we're going to look back on and be telling the next generation about. So it's cool to be a part of it. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Be safe. Listen. Try and understand where people are coming from. Applaud those trying to do good in this world. Can always use more people like that. Thanks for listening. We'll see you Tuesday. Today's Thursday. We'll see you Tuesday.